Hello, and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast. And we're back today with another episode of our ongoing anxiety series. Today is episode 266 with the return of Amishi Jha. This is the sixth episode in this series where we're speaking with different mental health experts, providers, researchers, all looking at different tools to work with anxiety in increasingly challenging times. So we're delighted to have Amishi back on the podcast. Amishi is a real powerhouse. She's the director of Contemplative Neuroscience and professor of psychology at the University of Miami. She's studied the brain's attention system and the effects of mindfulness training on resilience and performance in high-demand professions, including emergency service providers, military personnel, and medicine. Her research has been supported by the Department of Defense and featured by TED, NATO, the World Economic Forum, New York Times, and NPR. She also led the first large-scale study of mindfulness training with active duty service members. With all of that, she's also the author of the national bestseller Peak Mind. She's also the creator of a new app called Pushups for the Mind, which is coming out this summer. So this was a really interesting conversation in and around anxiety because Amishi has done so much research around attention and the different types of attention that we have available to us, then looking at that through the lens of mental health, stress, and anxiety. So she and Sharon talk about the role that mindfulness can play in mental health, cognitive resilience, and kind of what happens when there's a mismatch between our capacity and the challenge that we might be facing. Amishi talks about eustress and how it can serve us, attention as resilience, and then the different types of attention, including flashlight attention for clarity and focus, floodlight attention, which is more situational awareness, and then executive functioning. She gives some great instruction about how to begin attention training, and then they go on to debunk some common myths about stress and anxiety. Okay, so before we get into this episode, a couple of quick announcements. Sharon has a new course headed your way, Buddhist Personality Types, which is being hosted by Tricycle Online. This is an in-depth 5-section course that starts July 7th. This is a topic that's not often covered in the realm of meditation or Buddhism, but really fascinating, talking about how we can uncover our purified nature. It's working with how greed becomes faith, aversion becomes wisdom, and delusion becomes equanimity. We've got a special 20% off coupon as well for all of you listeners out there. You can use the code 3personality20. That's the number 3, then the word personality, and then the numbers 20. So you can sign up and get all the details at SharonSalzberg.com. All right, so let's dig into another episode of our anxiety series, Sharon Salzberg and Dr. Amishi Jha.
Welcome, everyone. I'm here speaking with my good friend, the wonderful Amishi Jha, and a warm welcome to you, Amishi. Where are you now?
I am in Miami, and it's so great to be with you.
It's so great to be with you. Thank you for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective about mental health and stress. I've been focusing on talking about and asking people about anxiety, so I think the larger topic of mental health will provide a really good context for that. And the last time you were on the podcast, we were talking about your book, Peak Mind, which came out in 2021. How the years go by. It seems like yesterday that book came out. That's amazing. And maybe the place we could start today is with your definition of the role of mindfulness training in resilience and mental health and how you approach it in your work.
Yes. So I am a cognitive neuroscientist. And so the bulk of the work that I do in my lab is tied to understanding how the human brain pays attention and the factors that make it vulnerable to lapses and distractibility that basically start diminishing our capacity to pay attention, how that all works in the brain, and then how to strengthen attention so that we can function more fully and wholly in our lives. And mindfulness training in our work has really been around what I would say we call cognitive resilience. So, is there a way in which we can train the mind so that these factors that make it vulnerable, make attention vulnerable, really don't have that kind of diminishing or degrading effect, and we can stay steady even if challenges and other kind of factors might challenge us. And in many ways, I say mindfulness training is the brain training that allows us to grow this capacity to pay attention so that our mood, our goals, our ability to interact with other people is all better protected and works better.
So, what's going on in our brains when we get stuck in not handling stress very well?
You know, it's kind of interesting with stress because just the term stress is a little bit underspecified. We've got stress that can be so motivating and beneficial in some sense, and we'd call that eustress, right? The letters EU in front of the word stress, which is essentially the right amount of challenge that can activate our ability to get in gear and act in ways that serve us, and that even make us feel more interested and engaged and even curious about things. But unfortunately, if we amp that up, if we keep increasing the amount of challenge we experience, which is essentially this feeling that, and this is sort of the most broadly the way that I would describe stress, is this sense that my challenges in this moment and my capacity to meet those challenges are mismatched. So in the eustress condition, it's that, yeah, they're mismatched right now, but I'm fully resourced to be able to meet those challenges. And when we have that feeling, it can be motivating and exciting and beneficial. But as the amount of challenge increases, that mismatch between our capacity and the challenge starts to grow. And that's where we get into really this feeling of distress. And the distress piece is where all the bad feelings come from. This sense that I'm worried, I'm fearful about what might happen, I'm uncertain. When those kinds of feelings start emerging, they hijack our attention. So when it comes to sort of brain functioning and attentional functioning, we see things like anxious thoughts as captivating and pulling our attention so that instead of being able to do the thing that we're worried about, we are grabbed by the thoughts themselves, the feelings themselves. And that hijacking of attention actually results in our performance getting worse and worse and worse. So it's this sort of multifactorial issue of stress is a shifting landscape, but when we've got enough of it, we start becoming preoccupied with our own thoughts regarding the stressor and diminishing our capacity to pay attention, which unfortunately leads to this bad cascade of feeling worse and then performing worse and so on and so on.
Well, let's talk about attention a little bit and how, your work really centers around the power of attention, how to harness our attention. And let's talk about that in the context of resilience, because I think you have such an empowering message. So how much of a say do we really have in what we pay attention to and how we pay attention?
I think we've got quite a bit of say, and we have a different capacity that is more so than being able to willfully guide our attention, to know what's happening in this moment, to even know where our attention is. And I think, yes, like you said, maybe breaking down what I mean by the term attention and sort of its multifaceted nature could be helpful. So I'll start by basically talking about the types of attention that we know about with regard to brain function. And And the last time I was on, we actually talked in detail about sort of the metaphors of attention, but I'll give sort of a review because it relates to the conversation we're having right now regarding stress and mental well-being. So attention, most broadly, we would say, is the propensity of the human mind to prioritize and privilege some information and not other information. So it has this selective quality. And in some sense, we think attention developed over the course of human evolution because the brain suffered from this big problem of information overload, so that it couldn't fully process everything happening around it and even within it to make decisions about how to act and interact with the world around it. So attention became a solution that was essentially saying, well, you don't have the computational power, brain, to know everything. So pick a subset out of everything that's happening and use your full capacity to interrogate that. And so when we talk about the types of attention, we're actually talking about the ways in which this privileging and prioritizing happens. And does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the one way we can actually select information is in this very narrow and restricted way that is really preoccupied with the content. So right now, for example, I would like to prioritize your voice, understand your words, and focus in on this conversation more so than what's happening outside my door or my preoccupation about what might be happening in the news or anything else that might be going on in my mind or in the world around me in this moment. So I'm going to be narrow and directed in how I use my attention. And the metaphor I like to use for this type of attentional functioning is that it's like a flashlight or something called selective attention. And this flashlight idea is that we can shine our mental resource, our attentional flashlight, whatever it is that we direct it toward, we get clearer, crisper information. And everything else is sort of darkened or in the shadows, not at the front of our mind with this increased granularity and resolution. And what else I like about this metaphor of a flashlight is it goes to what you were describing a moment ago. How much do we have a say in what we pay attention to? So even the notion of a flashlight gives us a sense of agency. We can direct and point this attentional resource. We can direct our flashlight. We can hold it steady. But the other feature of this flashlight is that it can get pulled. So, if you think about an actual flashlight, you're walking outside and, in the dark, and you have a path you're following, let's say, you're willfully guiding the flashlight to the ground beneath you so that you step in the right way and don't twist your ankle or, go off the path. If all of a sudden you hear a strange sound, or even if you thought you heard a strange sound, which gets to our comments about anxiety, just the worry about potentially having a sound occur, you might in that moment take the flashlight and immediately change what it's pointing to. So it's maybe coming from the bushes or the tree or wherever you thought the sound came from. So there is this willful, directed quality of attention, but it can also be pulled and captured and sort of kept hostage by certain kinds of events that happen either in the world or in our minds. But I think the point of this way of thinking about attention, and it does relate to what we were talking about a moment ago about stress, it has a sense of agency and a restricted focus, where sometimes we can be willful about how we direct it, and other times we're at the mercy of whatever it gets pulled toward. But maybe I'll move on to sort of almost the exact opposite way to think about attention to broaden out what I mean by we can both point it, direct it, but also know what's going on. So the second kind of major metaphor that I like to use when it comes to attention is not so much the flashlight that's narrow and constrained, but something like a floodlight so that it's broad and receptive and there are no boundary conditions. Everything is on the table in terms of what we should be paying attention to. This is something we might formally call the brain's alerting system. So we're alert, present. And what this system prioritizes isn't content like the path I'm walking on or the thought I'm having, but the moment. So it's about broadly paying attention to everything that's happening right now. And if you think about it, we can't actually be alert in the past or the future. We have to, alertness is about what's happening right now. And I really think this system is extremely powerful in terms of giving us access to understanding what's happening, situational awareness, we might say. But it's very, very different than that kind of narrow constrained type of attention. So we've got this prioritizing and privileging based on content, like the flashlight, or the moment, like this floodlight. And I'll just end by talking about this third system on this topic of a third way that we prioritize and privilege information when it comes to our attention, which is that we can do it based on our goals. And this is something called executive functioning. So the idea is that there is a goal state. We have something we want to do. We've got an aspiration of what we'd like to achieve. And then there's action, what we actually do. And this system's job is to ensure that there's alignment between the two, that our goals and our actions are aligned. And its job, in some sense, is to course correct when we're off track. So either we've lost sight of the goal or our action isn't aligned and we've got to make sure we get it back on track. So I think that it's really useful to think about all three of these ways we pay attention as it comes to thinking about our mental health. And I'd love to kind of get into that with you next. But I thought it'd be helpful to just understand even what I mean when I use the term attention.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I was thinking, listening to you about different things, like how each of these can get distorted when we're feeling overwhelmed by stress or anxiety. We ruminate, we worry, we get obsessed. So is that kind of a weird manifestation of the flashlight, and we can't prioritize, and everything gets distorted, so maybe you could go into that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is where, many times when I talk about the fact that I study attention, the sort of impression I get from the way people respond to that is like, oh, this is this cold cognitive system. But actually, attention is used for so many things that we do, including our ability to experience emotion. And it really influences how we experience and respond to the emotional life of the mind, if you will. So when we think about the flashlight, maybe it's useful to think about each of these systems and how things can go wrong in the context of our mental health. So one way we can start thinking about attention is really its utility. So we talked about all three types of attention. Now let's talk about how they might be utilized in the context of our emotions and our sense of stress, our experience of stress. Oftentimes people think when I describe that I study the human brain's attention system, that this is this cold cognitive system that has nothing to do with our emotional life. But that's actually 100% false. One of the biggest uses of our attention is for our experience and expression of emotion. And of course, this is where that experience of stress can become very problematic. So let's just take each of the systems I talked about, and maybe I can talk through how they relate to our emotional functioning, especially in the context of overwhelming feelings like stress and anxiety. So the first system that we talked about, this flashlight of attention, again, we have a sense of agency and purpose. We want to use it for something. We want to direct it willfully. So let's say we're directing it toward having a conversation with somebody, pointing it to them so that their input in the conversation is our focus. Of course, when everything's going great, we can willfully direct our attention, no problem. But let's say in the middle of that, we have a disturbing thought arise, maybe a memory, something triggered by something the person said, or just something that arrived in our mind. I've certainly had this happen to me, even in the middle of giving formal presentations. Something somewhat innocuous. I remember one time I was giving a presentation, and right before I got on stage, I got this alert that said a hurricane is headed toward Miami. And I was not in Miami. And I had that kind of panicky feeling. And I thought I had it under control. But in the middle of my talk, in the middle of my lecture, all of a sudden I had that kind of fear response of the thought that landed that said, oh no, I hope it doesn't come to Miami, and I hope everybody in my family's okay. So what happened in that moment? Essentially, my flashlight with all of my intention and my goal was to have it directed toward the content of my presentation. But in that moment, it got hijacked. It got hijacked by a worry, right? That I generated in my mind, or even if I didn't generate it, it landed in my mind in that moment, and it pulled me toward that particular mental content. Now, thankfully, I was able to recover and get my flashlight back. It's easier when you're sort of in the hot seat because I'm the only one speaking since it's my lecture. But there's so many instances where this kind of thing can happen, and typically we'll recover. But there are certain kinds of psychological disorders and certain kinds of overwhelming situations in which we may not recover. So, for example, probably the most, I guess, prominent notion of attentional dysfunction in this flashlight system is the psychological illness of depression. So we often think of depression as a mood disorder, and it is. There's depressogenic thought arising in the mind that is overwhelming and unrelenting in some sense. But from an attentional perspective, what might be going on is that depressogenic content, negative mood, negative thoughts arise in the mind, and the flashlight has this propensity to get captured by them and almost pulled to the point where you cannot yank it away. Sometimes we'll talk about this as sort of attentional rubbernecking, like kind of like when you're driving down the freeway and there's some kind of traffic accident and you're driving your car, but your neck is sort of rubbernecking back toward the event. You just can't let go of it. So this is now a situation in which it's about psychological functioning, emotional functioning, but it's definitely related to our attention, because if we don't have hold of that flashlight anymore, we're not in control. And that negative content can hold us over and over again, which is where states like rumination and worry can be, again, and negative thought can just be on and on and on. So does that make sense in terms of the connection between the flashlight, at least, and negative emotion and stress?
It makes total sense. And, I'm thinking of my friend, my colleague, Sylvia Borstein, who describes herself as a recovering catastrophizer. and it's just that, like if this is what she would say or has said, that, she's the kind of person who she calls one of her adult children and they don't answer the phone. It's like the worst must have happened. She said, it never occurs to me they're taking a shower.
Right. Right.
Or they fell in love. They don't feel like talking to their mother. And I think that's the main reason, in a way, why she got into meditation practice was because of the anxiety, the distress that she was feeling, and both in her nervous system, and I would bet anything in her relationships with her adult children. And, and so she may have the same kind of thoughts. In fact, I think she does, but she has so much more space from them, and she doesn't get captured in the same way.
Right. And I mean, I think that I would say in the early days of my my introduction to mindfulness practice, for example, this made a lot of sense to me. The notion of really cultivating a better relationship to my attentional flashlight made a lot of sense to me. And what I was doing in something like a breath awareness practice, where I would say, okay, direct the flashlight toward the sensations of the breath. Notice when your mind has wandered away. And when that happens, just direct it back, refocus. So focus, notice, and refocus. And that being able to do that to me meant that as those very salient emotional experiences or thoughts occurred, I could kind of pull my attention back to where I wanted it to be. And it was a bit of muscling, where it's not over here, it's over here now. And I felt a stronger sense of being able to do that. But what was interesting is that, we talked about 3 systems of attention. This is only one of the 3 systems, the flashlight approach. So I started getting even more curious about practices beyond the breath awareness practice, something more like an open monitoring practice, and what that is cultivating in terms of our attentional functioning as it relates to vulnerabilities in these other systems of attention. So maybe we talk about this alerting system now and how that relates to stress and how that relates to how we can cultivate it and how it helps us. Because just like the flashlight, it's another prominent system of how our attention functions. So as we already talked about, this floodlight or alerting system is broad, receptive, and everything that's happening right now should be where we're putting our mental energy. Nothing is off the table. And the reason we want to do this, because if you think about what it means to be alert, you don't know what could be most relevant in this moment. So if you're driving a car and you see flashing lights by a construction zone, or you're walking and you see, maybe, again, flashing lights or some kind of alarm system that's going off, you'd say, pay attention. But that's not this sort of flashlight approach of narrow and directed is just broadly be tuned into what's happening right now. If you're driving, it could be construction equipment that might land in your path as you're driving, or maybe people, strange traffic pattern, whatever it is. So being broad and receptive makes a lot of sense, and why you should be open to everything makes sense because it might guide what you do next. But sometimes, and this is, I think, what we might describe as hypervigilance. So this vigilance we need to have in the context of disorders like anxiety or PTSD is the floodlight or alerting system on overdrive. So we're not just in the now, we are hyper in the now, meaning we cannot move away from the now. There's a constant sense of checking and rechecking and broadly trying to take in everything that's happening right now, which doesn't always serve us. In fact, it makes it so that we cannot use our flashlight or even have goals because we're just sort of stuck to what's happening right now. Now, when it comes to our psychological health, this could be quite problematic because we lose the capacity to narrow and focus when needed and constrain information processing. It feels like kind of an assault on everything around us kind of coming into our system, whether we wanted to or not. And by the way, that's not just sort of sights and sounds from the environment, but even the way we tune into our own body sensations, which is something that happens in people that have high, what we call anxiety sensitivity. So you might notice, this happens to people sometimes where you might notice, for example, oh my goodness, I feel a little gurgling in my stomach. And it comes to the point where it's like, oh, maybe I'm excited about something, which could be a way to interpret that. Or, oh no, I have a terrible illness, or think I'm going to faint, or I'm going to pass out. So all of a sudden now the arising of body sensations can become overblown with a preoccupation, which in that moment ends up hijacking, kind of overtaking all of our attentional systems. The flashlight now gets stuck on that thought, or you lose track of your goals. So we go from having 3 functional attention systems that sort of trade off in what their prominence is, to everything starting to fall apart because we are now hyper vigilant to what's going on. So I hope that makes sense too, that again, attention and our emotional life are completely yoked when it comes to alerting as well. And then when we talk about sort of executive functioning, or, the metaphor I sometimes give is like a juggler, the thing that allows us to kind of keep multiple things in the air, prioritize and manage our behavior. Oftentimes, difficult content makes us lose what the goal is altogether. We don't know what we should be doing, so we can never guide our actions to ensure that that we're following through on them. And people that suffer from things like attention deficit disorder will say this, that it's just they're dropping lots of balls. They can't keep all the things in mind in the moment to manage and prioritize their actions. So pretty quickly we see that attention is not a cold cognitive system, but one that is deeply intertwined with our emotional life and our emotional experiences. And by the way, that executive functioning system is also the thing that we need to regulate our emotions, to ensure that our expression and experience of an emotion is sort of proportionate to what's appropriate in the moment. And when we start losing that capacity, things continue to be problematic, and we kind of can't get a hold of ourselves to get back to some kind of steady state.
Well, I can see why we use phrases like overwhelmed by stress. Where people will say that, I just feel overwhelmed. So if you were just starting to work with someone who had never before done any kind of attention training and was experiencing, say, high levels of anxiety or being overwhelmed by stress, where would you begin with them?
Yeah, I think that the first step is to just get some familiarity and friendliness with this capacity we have to willfully guide where our attention is. And so I think oftentimes it's to give a very, in terms of formal practice, just very sort of straightforward instructions to pick something to have your attention anchored on. So pick a target for directing your flashlight. And It could be the breath, but for many people that doesn't work. It can actually be very destabilizing when you are really gripped with a lot of anxiety or stressful experiences to use that. So it could be something like the feel of your feet on the ground, something that is very explicit, sensory, and doesn't necessarily have a lot of cognitive overload. There's no meaning behind focusing on with your feet, the sensation of your feet on the ground. So it's a good neutral anchor. And then, the instruction is obviously to have the goal of having your attention directed there, to notice when your mind wanders and to return it, as many, sort of foundational practices are with mindfulness training programs. The goal is not about keeping your attentional flashlight on the target. I mean, you can have that goal, but that's not a realistic goal because our attention is just prone to moving around. So the way that I like to describe it is we should not only aim to direct the flashlight, but to befriend this notion of finding our flashlight just over and over again. And as you're doing this practice over a short period of time, and begin very, very, very small periods of time, 3 to 6 minutes, it's just, where's your flashlight right now? If you can find it, great, that's a win. Just getting a sense of, I have this thing called my capacity to pay attention, and I can check in on it, and then I can gently and in a self-supportive way get it back to the thing I want it to be on, and there it'll go off again, and kind of checking it out to know where it is, and moment by moment, again with this spirit of I'm my own best teammate to get the flashlight to be where I want it to be. And I think doing that for some period of time, at least in my experience working with folks that do have sort of protracted periods of high stress and high demand, whether they're military service members or first responders or medical professionals, it returns to people this sense of control that often gets lost during these high stress periods. Like, I can feel my feet on the ground right now, and I can keep it there for whatever short interval there is before it may go off. And once we have that sense of stability, we can start working with an exploration of even what it is that may repeatedly pull us away, which is sort of the next step of understanding, where does our mind keep going to? And is there something we can learn from the nature of our own distractibility that can further give us intimacy and friendliness with our own mind? So that's sort of the first step in my mind, is to give all of our participants these simple tools that normalize distractibility and remind them of their capacity to get a sense of where they are moment by moment.
That's beautiful. That's great. And I want to hear your thoughts about some of the common myths we might be holding just kind of culturally, having to do with being overwhelmed or feeling way stressed out or feeling very anxious. That, for one thing, it's often told to us that it's a sign of weakness or it's just overreacting. And I wonder if you have something that you'd like to say about that.
Yeah, no. And this is something, actually a deeper point about how attention works. And I think it's worth getting into this. I don't think you and I have ever talked about this, but I thought it'd be good to bring it up now.
I'm just going to interrupt Amishi to say we're friends. So in times when I would stay with her in Miami, and I'm a real night owl, and she was like a seriously working woman with 2 kids, and I would keep her up till like 2 or 3 in the morning debating these points, the poor woman. But we never got into this one, so I'm waiting to hear.
Well, I love those late nights, but a little groggy in the morning, but love the time with you. So here's the thing to know about attention. And attention now is, let's think about it as a fuel or a resource. We already talked about the 3 main systems of attention, but when we put it all together, it is a type of mental resource that we hold. And we know a lot about how this resource gets deployed, the circumstances that allow it to get deployed. So I'm going to give you like a very simple, I'm going to invite you to my laboratory, basically.
Great.
And so if I had you come to the lab and do one of our experiments, I'm going to describe the experiment now. So you'd come in and I would say, okay, you're going to see a series of faces on the screen. Let's say 1 or 2 faces. And what you're going to do when you see this face is really try to remember it. Just look at all the features of it. And we'll make it a little bit hard. So it's hard to verbalize this face. We get rid of all the hair and any extraneous features. They're all black and white, monochrome, we really want to make it so that you're having to, in a granular way, get the visual representation of this face. And then after maybe half a second, the one face or two faces, whichever the number of items are that we're asking you to remember, will disappear from the screen. And then for a few to several seconds, it could be up to 3 seconds or so, there's nothing on the screen. And then we'll give you a test item that basically asks you, by presenting a single face, hey, was this the face I asked you to remember? And then you say yes or no. And, half the time it's yes, half the time it's no. So that's a pretty straightforward experiment, right? So then you'll have another trial. We've got another face or two faces, and you're trying to remember it again, so on and so forth. So what we know is that when I give you a single face to remember, your accuracy is quite good. People are able to remember the single face with high accuracy. They get it right. With two faces, you're a little bit worse. If I increased it to three faces, you're a little bit worse. So the load or the demand on our ability to remember information over what we call working memory, short intervals, the more we increase the demand, the more challenged our performance is. And this is just a very well-established thing. But here's what's interesting. So now I give you a series of these trials. Sometimes it's one face, sometimes it's two face. I'm going on and on and on and on for maybe 20 minutes of these trials. One of the things that I was very interested in is what happens if I just had a more demanding trial versus a less demanding trial. And so basically, how's my performance on the current trial if the last trial I had required me to remember two faces, which was more demanding, than one face? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is that your performance on the current trial is better if you had just received a more demanding trial versus a less demanding trial. So this is the way I think about it. It's like another metaphor. Attentional control, which all of these tasks rely on attentional control to hold that memory item, to encode it, etc. Attentional control is almost like, you could say, an electric stove. So unlike a gas stove, and we live in Miami when nobody really has gas stoves. We all have electric stoves. What happens? You turn on the stove, it takes a while, the coils heat up. You turn off the stove, the coils are still hot. So simply turning the stove on and off doesn't instantly eviscerate the heat in the coil. So that's what I'm saying. It's like an electric stove in that by having a high demand trial, the coils are heated up, all my resources are online, and no matter what happens next, even though I don't know what the next trial is going to be, that cognitive control, that attentional control stays online. It's just present. This is why the next trial will benefit if I had high demand versus low demand. So this is telling us something. This is saying that when something is challenging or demanding, the technical term is upregulate. We bring forward our cognitive resources to meet that demand. And then those cognitive resources stay online to help us do whatever's next. That makes sense. One of the most common tasks this working memory task I just described is pretty straightforward. I think is easy to understand. But most tasks that have established this pattern are what are called conflict tasks. So these are a different category of tasks, and I'm not going to get into all the details of what those require. But in the case of remembering one face or two faces, there's no real conflict. It's just demand. But there are other experiments in which you actually experience conflict. You don't know what to do. And when it's high conflict, the subsequent trial benefits. And when it's low conflict, the trial doesn't benefit as much. So how does this relate to everything we're talking about in the question that you raised regarding the term overwhelm and how our mind is responding to circumstances? Essentially, what I'm saying is when there is this sense of demand that we are experiencing, and whether that is a conflict type of demand where something's not the way I want it to be, or just there's more for me to do here, our attention system responds to us and brings to bear all these cognitive resources. Oftentimes, the thing that results in our sense of demand or conflict isn't even anything external. It's our own mind generating the worry or preoccupation that sets in motion the same chain of events. It's like if I have the thought, something bad might happen next, or not even that. What if something bad might happen next? I have now, in my mind, said this is a high demand situation. I better bring cognitive resources forward. And then all of a sudden, I'm going to use those cognitive resources, since they're present in my mind, to generate a lot more concepts, to entertain all the possibilities, et cetera. So, this is all to say the experience of overwhelm is very much, we are participating in that. It's not some kind of objective thing that's happening where there's a circumstance that's, in some objective way overwhelming. We are constantly interacting with what we perceive to be demanding circumstances. And sometimes that in and of itself can expend our attention to the point of exhaustion. So that worry and preoccupation and even saying to ourselves, this is so stressful, is continuing to allow us or require us, because of the kind of nature of the way our brain is organized, to use up attentional control. And unfortunately, this means if we're spending it out just in the worry or anticipation, when the demands actually may be high in the external environment, we may have nothing left to actually give to the circumstances. So I don't fault people for feeling overwhelmed, and I, of course, don't. But I think it's important to understand the participatory nature of how we are continually using up resources. And if we treated the arising of a thought slightly differently, without this ballistic need to then do the next set of, conceptual elaboration, maybe we could protect ourselves and from spending out this precious attentional resource when it may not serve us to do so.
Well, that's why I think what you're offering is very empowering. And it's just a fine line for a lot of people, to feel that there is something I can change or cultivate or strengthen. And the difference between that and feeling guilty or, like putting oneself down, like I'm just weak if I were stronger. And I'm especially thinking of your work, which seems to be the predominant, mode of your work with people in high stress professions, the military, high performance athletes, first responders, as you said, healthcare workers, and how often burnout comes to be. And people sometimes say, well, that's because I wasn't strong enough or I didn't care enough. And really, they care a lot. But there are other elements that may be at work that are leading to burnout.
Absolutely. And I would say what I hope that came through in my invitation for you to come to the lab is this idea that if your attention works in this way, meaning if there's a high demand, you bring all of your brain's attentional resources to bear on addressing that demand, is very normal. It's a healthy functioning of your attention. It's what it should be doing. It's what it's designed to do. When demand is high, bring the resources so I can solve the problem. And so I don't want anybody to feel like this is a problem in some sense that of course, if there's concern, I'm going to bring my mind to try to solve that. And it's the efficiency of being able to bring full attentional resources. That is the strength of our mind. But unfortunately, like we were just saying, it can also weaken us. So the thing we want to, instead of focusing on, I'm not strong enough or there's something wrong with me, to actually start looking at what is happening moment by moment. So if a challenge has occurred and I am seeing this as a demanding circumstances that warrants my attention, to really keep paying attention to it, where if the thought is one generated in your own mind, to be able to watch that and say, yes, that is a thought that has arisen. Is that an actual demand? Or is it a possible demand? Does it actually require me to go through and do all the information processing to solve this problem or continually work to try to solve this problem? Maybe, maybe not. And just a little bit of distance between what arises in our mind and this very natural and ballistic need that we often feel we have to try to engage in problem solving around it, it can loosen that grip and actually say, let's see if I really need to try to expend all that energy into solving this problem. Burnout in many ways has these same features. And one of the things we know, there's a big recent meta-analysis and all these studies of healthcare professionals and medical students that had experienced burnout. One of the biggest costs of burnout is attentional decline. So people are less attentive because of burnout, or I shouldn't say because of burnout, corresponding to burnout. This is where I think that we can see the costs of it. But if we start from a place of there's something wrong with me, the fact that my brain is working this way, that's not true. Your brain is actually working exactly the way it should. It's starting to just loosen the grip of the thought arising and what I do next in terms of trying to solve the problem, or the difficult emotion arising and how I'm going to treat it, instead of orienting to it as it's there, it's present, and it will arise and pass away, to say, I've got to now solve it. I've got to regulate. I've got to change the circumstances. Maybe, maybe not. So I don't know if that gets at what you were describing as, how people can respond a little bit differently to and I do this a lot, even in my own practice. Like, even when my mind wanders, sometimes I'll even put my hand on my heart and be like, oh, look at that. Your mind, it's doing what minds do. Minds wander. And that just changes our whole way of kind of relating to the nature of our mind. It gives us more of a sense of a self-supportive approach to this. And it like dials down this sort of feeling that we have that there's an immediate action, a mental action we may need to take. And that distance can be very, very useful to empowering us to kind of hold the flashlight long enough to decide if we're going to do anything about it at all, or just let the thought or emotion sort of be on its way.
That's great. Something you just said reminded me of this woman I worked with for a while through the Garrison Institute and their program for domestic violence shelter workers. And she was actually a director of a shelter for domestic violence. And she said at one point, based on her meditation experience, I have to learn to be able to distinguish a crisis from an emergency. Like, some things are really intense and demanding, and other things are a lot wilder than that, but not everything is an emergency, which had been her previous relationship. And so she was pretty overwhelmed. So I want to also...
I like that. Can I say one other thing kind of related to this?
Please do.
Well, I was going to say, the other thing is, and this has to do really with this misnomer of compassion fatigue in some sense, right? Where people say that, and it's like sort of a partner to this notion of burnout. But in some sense, if we look at the symptoms of what people in quotes call compassion fatigue, it's this essentially exhaustion that comes from caring. That's the way it's described. But when you really look at it, what seems to be the case is the emotional resonance people experience. Oftentimes, caregivers have just exquisite emotional resonance. They see somebody else going through a difficult time, and they are taking on and resonating with that emotional state, which unfortunately means now it's not just that they now are in distress in the same way the person that they're seeing in distress is in distress. So in some ways, we want to think about this is that distancing of, I see suffering, I see difficulty, I see it with care, but I'm going to hold my own attention in a way that isn't going to move toward resonance and is instead going to move toward action in the service of alleviating that challenge. And so, again, very, very subtle, but I think powerful relationships between an attentional stance and seeing suffering in the world. And a lot of times it's what in this change of orientation toward emotional resonance, or emotional empathy, as it's often called, which is this resonating in the emotion of another, is a shift toward what we'd call cognitive empathy, an understanding of the suffering of another. And that will take a bit of attentional control, because it may be your inclination to want to resonate with the emotional experience, but you're holding steady. You're holding that flashlight in a way that says, my emotional state is right here, and I'm seeing that emotional state, and I'm holding it with care. So oftentimes, again, attentional control allows us to be better empowered, not only, in a very powerfully, to see the distinctions between crises and emergency, but even how to act in a way that maximizes our ability to show care, because we are not gripped with our own overwhelming sense of emotion.
It's great. I want to talk about your new offering that has just come out into the world, and that's a new app called Pushups for the Mind. So tell us about it.
Yeah. And I want to just begin by thanking you. You were so helpful to me as my dear teacher and friend through the entire process. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
The app is essentially a partnership project that started with the U.S. Department of Defense. So when my book came out, a lot of the book Peak Mind has anecdotes and stories and input from people that are in these what we'd call tactical professional settings. So people that are emergency services folks, military service members, et cetera. And it resonated with a lot of people in those communities, and in particular military service members. So the Department of Defense essentially approached me, members of the Uniformed Services University, and said, what do you think about turning your book into an app of sorts so that you're going to have the lessons come alive to us, almost like an audio book. But then all the practices that I describe at the end of the book, which are the core program that came out of our, many, many years of research, can be offered as a program that people could follow in a more self-guided way. And I thought, yes, the research on mindfulness apps is that they're quite variable. I mean, the most we can say about mindfulness apps is that people will download them on their phone, but we don't really know if they use them much. In fact, we know that they don't use them much after that. So it's a little bit, I don't know, I guess skeptical about the way in which this could be offered. But we set it up so that the initial part of the journey of this app, it's all around understanding the nature of attention, similar to the topics we were just describing. What is attention? What makes it vulnerable? How can we strengthen it? And really the solution my lab has found that's the most effective out of many that we've looked at for strengthening and protecting attention is mindfulness training. So it's the journey of understanding all those points and then beginning to get exposed and practicing immediately. Essentially by the third lesson, we're practicing already. And then after there's sort of this foundational audiobook type course, people do 12 minutes a day, 4 days a week for 4 weeks as the core program. And because I'm a researcher, I really wanted to give people the opportunity to build in some kind of self-evaluation metrics so they can see themselves how taking on this journey may have beneficial effects. And I'm very happy to say that the military version of this, so it's called pushupsforthemind.mil, has been out since end of February, I think. And we've now been able to give it away for free to all active duty service members, National Guard, and reserves. And my worry that, that people are going to be left to their own, they're going to download it and not do much else. I was very happy to hear that a lot of the military academies are now offering the app and even providing it as part of their sort of leader training so that leaders in training can use this app to guide their own community with just a community experience traversing through the app together. So I'm very happy to say that the app is now available for the public on the Apple and Google Play stores so people can check it out themselves.
One of the things that I find distinctive about this app is really, it reminds me of when I wrote this book called Real Happiness, which had a lot of meditation exercises in it. And a friend of mine was flipping through it and he said, "Oh, you wrote this one in American." So in your app, which I've seen, there is no kind of jargon or sense of needing to join a club of esoteric thinkers, or anything. It's very, very practical. And I'm sure that was by design.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that, the thing I can say for sure is that every single person who will encounter this app, download this app, use this app, has an attention system, will be faced by challenges in their lives. And I think that taking a journey that really is around the very sort of natural way our mind will want to be as we face not just a moment or two, but maybe a protracted, weeks and months of challenge, is a good entry point to starting to think through how that's working out for us and if there's a different approach we can take, and to empower everybody to understand that really, we already know in this particular moment in human history that physical exercise is necessary for physical health. But we also know now through modern brain science that mental exercise helps keep our brains and our minds and our lives healthfully filled to fully flourish and thrive and enjoy our lives. So push-ups for the mind is really that sort of metaphor throughout of we all know what a push-up is and we understand that it's beneficial, what does it look like when we talk about training and keeping our mind healthy? And mindfulness exercises seem to be a very useful way to do that, at least based on a growing body of research.
So you're saying the program is 12 minutes a session, 4 times a week. And I'm sure that's backed by research that you've done in your lab.
Yes. That's the other fun part of this, is that it's a culmination of a lot of our research effort, just in terms of how much, for how long, and in what way, where we've offered people a suite of practices over, we started out with something like 30 minutes a day we were asking people to do after they went through a 24-hour course, or something that I would say is a real inspiration for a lot of my effort now, mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? John Kabat-Zinn, our dear friend John Kabat-Zinn's program, which is something like that, 8 weeks, about 24 plus hours, 45 minutes a day for that program. And seeing those kinds of offerings as starting points, but then trying to see what people were actually doing. So even if you asked them to do 45 minutes or 30 minutes, what were they actually doing? And we were able to track that with some precision. And then saying, okay, what happens if we just give them the amount that looks to be the amount that people actually do, where we see beneficial effects in our metrics of attention and mood and stress, et cetera. And that number, at least in my hands, in my lab's hands, over a variety of high demand populations, was about 12 minutes a day, 4 days a week for 4 weeks. So that's the prescription we've put in. And what the feedback I've received, from the app and from those that have read my book is, I think I can do that. That's a reasonable goal. It feels less overwhelming. There's a way I can fit it into my schedule. And what I added into this app that again, I was very excited to do, because I think this is a challenge point for many people that want to practice and understand that it could be beneficial, is how do I develop this habit so that I'm actually doing it? So in the app, essentially, we introduce people to the concepts and introduce them to the practices. But before they go on to the core program of this 12 minutes, 4 days a week for 4 weeks, we have something called the ramp up. And the ramp up is essentially just about habit formation. So we want you to do 3 minutes, or even 6 minutes if you'd like to, 4 days a week, and see if you can repeat that, just to wedge it into your schedule. Make just creating the time the priority. And then once you have a place in your daily schedule where you can do it, it's easy to kind of squeeze in more minutes. But if you never have a time when you do it, you're never going to be able to kind of get going in the whole process. So habit formation was really at the top of my mind in designing this thing, so that people felt supported to get to the 12 minutes a day, 4 days a week.
I just want to say that this is one of the topics we would discuss at 2 a.m. I'd say, really? Just 12 minutes a session? Just 4 times? So it's nice to have this conversation sort of in the daylight. So, well, probably nicer for you than it was for me. It was fine for me,
But I was going to say, it's not, the 12 minutes really is what I've described as the minimum effective dose. So this is so if you choose, there are some people that might say just one breath is all you need. And I would say not in a way that's tractable with our research methodology. Just giving people one breath does not seem to be enough that is resulting as their learning practices to be substantial enough that we can pick it up with objective metrics. 12 minutes was. So it is a threshold. And I think it gives people a concrete goal of what to shoot for, so to speak. But really, it's the beginning point. So the more you do beyond 12 minutes, the more you continue to benefit. And there are ways in which there's a formal practice element, but also what we describe as sort of on-demand or in-the-moment enactment of mindfulness practices and principles into one's daily life. So there's so much richness to how we can start incorporating this mindful mode into our day-to-day life. But I do think that the 12-minute prescription gives people sort of a relatively doable goal that starts the whole path in motion.
Well, I want to praise you, and really offer you a lot of respect for being both a scientist, a very rigorous scientist, and a practitioner, because I think it makes a very big difference. I can remember someone else's study at one point which didn't make any sense to me in terms of what they were claiming, and was no effective mindfulness. And I thought that doesn't make sense. And then it turned out that their intervention was only one 5-minute session of mindfulness.
Yeah.
And I thought, I can't even remember my first 5 minutes of practice. And
Right.
it's a lot to expect that one little 5-minute sitting is going to do it all, And so, of course, they weren't finding the thing that seemed so logical to me would be a consequence of a more continuous practice. And so it makes a very big difference that you have that kind of inner experience as well.
Yeah, I think that, this is where I think modern contemplative neuroscience has a lot to say about the sort of norms within psychological research that say you should be at a distance and this should not be participatory. You should be objective. And I really think, and I teach a course called Mindfulness, Attention, and the Brain with undergraduates at the University of Miami. And the thrilling thing to me is that I see the impact of their practicing, because they all actually this semester got the app. So they were practicing as we went throughout the course. The thrilling thing to me is to see how their own insights and familiarity with not only the practices, but their own mind make them more rigorous scientists to not only do the kind of thing you said. And students will say that, like, 5 minutes? I have no idea what the first 5 minutes of my first practice had any impact on anything I did. So their skepticism, their understanding of how people understand practices, their understanding of how what they considered to be their level of mind wandering was maybe not accurate, and that they got more and more familiar with what the nature of their mind was as they practiced more. And all of these things, I think, are necessary to really, actualize the goal of understanding the nature of the mind if you're a cognitive neuroscientist, or understanding routes by which to help train the mind to strengthen it if you're a contemplative neuroscientist. So I'm really feeling that the separation of personal engagement and practices just should not be the norm, and people need to understand it. Now, of course, you always still apply the most rigorous objective tools possible, because just because you want it to be that way doesn't mean it is, but you need to have familiarity with what you're talking about. And thankfully, I'm seeing that more and more people in our, this growing field of contemplative neuroscience are starting to make that point.
Do you have a next project on the horizon for the Jha Lab, and what are you working on now?
Yeah, we have always really exciting, cool stuff that we're doing. To me, and I like the way that you described it when your book came out about, you wrote it in American, this notion of accessibility, of what we'd call, implementing in the real world or applying in the real world is really my interest. I mean, at the core of it, I'm a neuroscientist who's deeply interested in sort of the big questions about the nature of the mind, the organization of the brain. But on the other hand, we now have enough in our toolkit as scientists to be able to offer practical tools for people. And so the big projects that are coming up, one in particular that I'm very excited about, is a partnership with the LA County Fire Department, and offering them, again, minimum effective dose type training. And the program we're going to be offering them is really was the foundational inspiration for everything that I included in the app as well. A program that my colleague Scott Rogers and I have developed and studied for many years, mindfulness-based attention training. And this is the program that we will be offering the LA County Fire Department, and not sort of broadly speaking the entirety of the fire department, but what are called their peer support specialists. So these are the folks within that community, within that organization, who have raised their hand and said, I want to be a peer that my fellow firefighters can come to when they're experiencing psychological distress or life challenges. And so they become sort of the conduits for normalizing how we're going to talk about psychological health, how we're going to talk about trauma and stress. But it ends up that in some sense, they are the tip of the spear. They're getting not only their own experience of being a firefighter, but in some sense, secondary trauma based on everything that they're hearing. So the targeted intention here was, let's support those folks to be able to continue doing their work by offering them mindfulness training as to add to their toolkit. And we're going to be training them to become coaches, what we're calling MBAT, mindfulness-based attention training coaches, so that the practices that we're teaching them, they can have come alive sort of as on-demand offerings in their firehouses in an ongoing way. So whether that's beginning every morning meeting for the entire team in the firehouse with, a short practice, or during their after-action meetings, or recovering from a particular incident, bring these practices and concepts in a way that can help, as we talked about at the top of our conversation, ensure their own resilience through the challenge and difficulty that they're going to face over and over again, and as is the nature of their job, in the service of the rest of us who benefit from having skilled firefighters within our communities.
It's so great. I mean, especially in LA, when you think about it.
Yeah. Well, it was something. We were about to leave, and literally it was 2 days before our project was scheduled to launch that the fires started. So we've had to delay this by about 6 months. And it does break my heart a bit, because they were already in need before these fires happened. And now it's really, they're in a deficit. But I'm so glad that the leadership understands that, with the increase in challenge, we've got to increase and become innovative about the tools we offer our firefighters. And they're willing to do that, which means the world to us, because we can provide them these evidence-based tools now to support them and all those they serve.
It's really beautiful. I want to thank you, Amishi, so much for joining me today. And just remind all the listeners again, if you'd like to get Amishi's new app, Pushups for the Mind, it's available on both Android and iOS platforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. This was a lot of fun.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you're still with us, you've reached the end of the podcast. So if you'd like to learn more about Amishi's work, get a copy of her book, Peak Mind, or download the new app, Pushups for the Mind, you can head over to her website, amishi.com, AMISHI.com. And for those of you that are U.S. military service members, that app is free to download. So you can do that over at peakmind.media, PEAKMIND.MEDIA. For all things Sharon, including information about her upcoming course on Buddhist personality types, starting July 7th, you can visit her website, SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.